Hello from Maine. My name is Clay Hansen. I am a U.S. Air Force vet and hold a master's degree in chemical engineering. I'm going to offer an alternative to the current paradigm on climate change. I'm going to tell you that the leading contributor to climate change is not fossil fuels. It's underground nuclear bomb testing. I know, once you roll your eyes, I'll show you my proof. This is a graph of the CO2 change in concentration, global concentration, as described by NOAA. These data come from the Second Degree Institute. What I've also put on this graph are the above ground and below ground bomb detonations. And note the timing. We started blowing up our first bomb on the ground in 1958 because we started noticing after we blew up an entire island that we were seeing weather changes. It was getting colder. Brian Toon has done a great deal of work in modeling the global nuclear winter phenomenon. Anyways, we can see that when we started nuking these very hard, and in 1971 we blew up a 5 megaton bomb underground in Alaska that actually made this peak right here. And we can see that we caused this growth and swing in operation. You have to remember that when we do conventional bomb testing, it's a simple chemical reaction. A plus B yields C plus heat. But a nuclear reaction is A, mass, yields electromagnetic energy, light, in the complete spectrum, from IR to ultraviolet and beyond. This energy is then transferred to the mass around it, which results in your mushroom cloud and your great amount of heat release. But still, that photonic energy is still there. It's not going to suddenly disappear. When we detonate a bomb above ground, like we did in the 1950s when we blew up an entire island, most of the energy is going to go to space. But when we pull it underground, all the energy has to be absorbed by the Earth. Now that we've established a correlative link between underground nuclear testing and the steady climb in CO2 concentrations, let's step back and look at the overall thermodynamic balance. Our Earth is sitting here in space at homeostasis. It gets its energy from the sun. As the energy travel, it hits this side, and on this side, it's emitting energy back to space. As we orbit the sun, the radiant energy received changes because we get a little closer, and we get a little further as that orbit changes, with a cycle of about 9 to 11 years. The closer you get to the sun, of course, we get more energy. Further away from the sun, we get less energy. But in order to maintain the constant temperature, that is controlled through the incorporation and release of greenhouse gases. We already know this. Now, when the sun is transmitting energy, the driving force to put this energy here is a temperature difference between the surface of the sun, the skin temperature, and the surface of the planet. So the outer temperature here is at 6,000 degrees. The surface of the planet is, let's just assume 70 for average sake, so 298. So that's what's driving this temperature, this energy to get to this planet. Now, on this planet, the rock doesn't really absorb that much radiant energy, reflects a lot of it, but the oceans do. The surface of our planet is covered with 70% water. So the ocean surfaces take this energy from the sun, they incorporate it, and a little bit of energy change, a little bit of temperature change, and the gases that are dissolved in the water come out. Little known fact, gases dissolve in water inversely with temperature. So the colder it is, the more gases you get. Or like sugar, the hotter it is, the more sugar you get to dissolve. It's just the opposite with gases. So the deeper the water, the higher the concentration there will be of these dissolved greenhouse gases. So anyways, as we get more heat from the sun in the higher cycle, the CO2 takes that energy while it's in solution in the water, and the other greenhouse gases as well. And by that energy, it puts it in the air, and it takes the energy with it. So now the air warms up. What does that do? That increases the cold side, the emittance temperature that we're giving back to space. So if our input gets high, our output will also grow and get high. And if our input gets low, our output will also get low, because the water will cool, because the emittance is still releasing that same heat. Then the water cools, and as the water cools, it grabs those gases and puts them back in solution on the surface. and then the air cools, the admittance goes down, and balance is still maintained. So therefore, it's reasonable to assume that if fossil fuels are infecting this, which they are, we're actually adding to the system downstream of the control valve, whereas the ocean surface themselves are acting like a large industrial control valve. So it's reasonable to assume that the change in CO2 concentration and the change in fossil fuel use should pretty much line up as far as they should follow each other, right? Makes sense. That means that we have a direct relation between fossil fuels and CO2 release. And you know what? We do. If you put these two graphs together, which is the change in fossil fuel use and the change in, and this is in total watt hours, so it's based on actual energy, and in the change in CO2 concentrations, again, the same graph I showed you before, you see that these points line up perfectly until 1947. Gee, what happened in 1947? Well, one thing I did take, and you can look at the data on a plausible truthaboutclimatechange.com, is I took the data from 1800 until 1947 and I graphed it, and you actually get a very good correlation with 91% correlation factor. That'd be the Al Gore correlation, but it's only good till 1947. Al Gore was right, but the data he collected was in the middle of all these nuke tests in 1990. So there's really going to be difficult for him to tell the difference between what's normally happening with fossil fuels and what actually occurred with the nukes, because we were still testing pretty heavily back then. But now, for the last 15 years, in fact, there's been only one player in the game, which makes it very easy to tell where it's coming from. At this point, though, what do we know? We know that the timing of the gradient CO2 temperature change started about the same time as underground testing. We also know that on a macro thermodynamic basis, if you note that we took the entire bomb and put it underground, that the Earth has to absorb all of its energy, in whatever form it is. It still has to absorb that energy. The question is, how does it get there? What is its function? So let me step you through what I think happened. Inside the blast chamber, you're sitting there. You're a bomb, or you're watching the bomb. And suddenly there's a snap. A picosecond later, there's a sun in front of you, a very small sun with intense light. As the light grows, it hits the rock wall, and that energy starts engulfing the rock. It's pushing against it. It engulfs the rock and creates high energy plasma to store all that photonic energy. As the plasma physically pushes against the rock, there's a filament, a tiny filament, that on a quantum level, that following that standard driving force is at 6,000 degrees, and it wants to find the coldest place. The rock is at 55 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 200, I believe. But anyways, the rock isn't as cold as the water. The water is going to be maybe even below freezing if it finds it, because it's underground. But it's going to be very cold. It's going to be in the 30s. So it wants that rock. It wants that water. And plus, the water absorbs it well. Well, the rock's going to reflect it. So picture this fireball building up, building up, building up, and that filament growing, growing, growing. And it's growing very similar to how a streamer does in lightning coming from a cloud. A cloud will send several streamers out until it finds the one with the least resistance, and then send lightning down. Well, this is what is happening inside the rock. It is changing that rock to worm a small hole until it gets to the ocean or water. Straight, could be straight down, could be north, could be south, definitely not up, because we would have seen that. So another few seconds later, the fireball has reached a great size. It has engulfed the wall, pushing, doing physical work on that wall. But at the same time, that filament has now found its heat sink somewhere. And all of a sudden, all that energy disappears, just like a bolt of lightning. But in this case, it's photonic lightning. And it's not light you can see, because the rock's not going to let that pass. The closest thing the rock's going to let pass will be probably long wave IR. But it'd have to change the rock to do that. If you look at my thesis, my hypothesis in detail, you'll see what I mean. But when we measured just the size of the chamber and the heat, things didn't add up. We curve fit everything, and we said, look, we're not getting the bang for our buck. Let's lower the bomb size. But in my theory, that energy was still there, and it went to the ocean or deep water, and it ended up involving greenhouse gases. So somewhere at the same time that bolt finally went through, maybe 1,000 kilometers away, bubbles formed from the release of the saturated greenhouse gases within the cold water. Now they received a bunch of heat, and they're going to evolve. And as they float up from deep water, they're going to separate into these plumes of warm, oddly warm liquid. And when these plumes go out, they're going to mess with the weather, obviously. And the control scheme, our overall control, has now been disturbed because it used to be controlling greenhouse gases from the surface. Now we've shoved all the energy which normally would come from the surface, the radiant energy, which only comes from extraterrestrially, we've shoved it under the surface of the water. That, I know, is hard to believe, but somehow this energy went through the rock. And we have details and math in my thesis to show you, but it's really not that hard to believe, because we've already found on post-nuclear detonations above ground where rock has changed to quasi-crystals, things that normally don't occur in nature. In addition, we irradiate crystals, gems, all the time to change their emittance. So it becomes bluer or greener. So it's very easy, not only possible, but probable that this tremendous amount of photonic energy changed that rock to allow it to get to that heat sink. Okay, so my theory assumes that the energy traveled like lightning through opaque rock to some cold water somewhere. When this occurred, the release of greenhouse gases and water plumes described. Indeed, we've seen them, but how do they directly relate to underground nuke testing? The secret is actually following Walter Deming and using statistical process control. If you assume that our climate was in control prior to us testing, even with the addition of emissions from fossil fuels, then you can statistically grab those data and use those statistics to look at the future and see, are those data statistically normal or statistically abnormal? And then make corrective actions based on those. So I did that. I did that annually, and it did show up, the big signals in 1971 and in 1986, I believe. But they weren't showing me all the bombs. That's because the data are very, very normal. Are very, very noisy. So what I did was I looked at the monthly data, both for just the change and then the change in the change. And then I graphed the data on there. And what's interesting is if you follow standard statistical process control surfaces, and I set a trigger at a certain amount based on the smallest nuke I could find up here, then I can pick up every single North Korea nuke and the two fires. But the two fires, the major fires we had this year and last year, are not even close to the size of the smallest nuke. But that links directly to a continuous process, our climate control, that is being affected by those nuclear weapons. Now, hopefully, you've come to the point where you can see that we put an energy weapon underground, assumed it was a concussive weapon, and our planet is now still trying to get rid of all that excess energy, and it's a hell of a lot. My data show that the underground nuking between 1960 to 1999, which is pretty much when we stopped and other people kept going, is 3 times more CO2 than all the CO2 we released burning fossil fuels over the same time period. But if you look at it as an energy problem, if you understand that that was energy we put in there, then unlike our current treadmill solution, where we're trying to decrease emittance, stop eating cows, possibly start breeding, that we can pull this back and actually bring us to pre-1960 conditions. Think of it this way. You have an AC in your house. Your house is warm. That AC takes the energy from inside your house and puts it outside your house. Your house cools. That's what we need to do here. And I know it's going to sound very odd, but we need to take the energy in any form we can, whether it's solar or coal or natural gas, not nuclear. And we need to collect it and put it in batteries about the size of Nevada. and then we need to never use it. We're doing the same thing for any carbon sequestering program, like the X Prize project, the $100 million X Prize project that Elon Musk is currently running. Any carbon sequestering is going to require pulling energy out that the carbon already has, and then never using it. And if you look at just the fossil fuel point, hey, it's a reasonable number, but it'll never get us there. If you look at the energy point, now we can get us there. If we actually pull this energy out, slow enough to where we don't cause the swings, but fast enough to where we can actually get the CO2 to reincorporate back in the oceans. This isn't something that's going to be done quickly. It's going to take years. It took us years to get here, though. But if we act diligently enough, then we may be able to stop the swinging that we're seeing in the control right now, which is caused by all those plumes dancing around the ocean. But that'll stop first before we get to the energy. But you have to understand, it's a big problem. It seems insurmountable. But how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. If we stop looking at the current system as just fossil fuels, we have a chance to stop it. We have a chance to reverse it. And we have a chance to live past the next 30 years. Now, I need your help with this. I don't have a lot of time left. You do. My kids do. My grandkids do. I need you to force the government to stop testing any nuclear bombs on this planet, ever. And secondly, start a global program where, funded by the governments that did the damage, we start putting in solar on everyone's home, on every business we can, and we start making it totally use the energy here. Now, when we use that energy, it still goes into our climate system. Don't think that just because you use it, energy is never destroyed. It only changes form. But if we take the energy and store it and move it off planet or whatever, the base energy of the planet goes down, and she cools, and we can put her right back where she was. This is just climate engineering. Thank you very much. Namaste.